Welcome to a special edition of Crawford County Outdoors. I'm Dwayne Kohler, and we are at the Riverside Golf Course in Cambridge Springs today, and joining me, Tyson Johnston from the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy.
Yes.
So tell us about the event that's going on today.
So today is a tour of several properties that Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and other conservation organizations, including Ducks Unlimited, has helped to protect in this area. So today we're going to go on a tour, get on the bus, and we're going to look at our Halliday property, which is across the street here in Cambridge Springs, and head down south to our Cussawagga Bottom Conservation Area, and then travel to our Cats Natural Area, which is just north of Meadville.
So let me ask you a definition question here. Conservancy, the word. So my favorite hobby is hunting, and if I could only have one, it would be small game hunting and so on. That doesn't mean that because I like to bring home a pheasant or a rabbit or a deer once in a while, that doesn't mean that I'm hurting the environment in any way, does it?
That's part of conservation. So we're managing our resources, and we're working to protect the land, to give habitat for those species, and for folks to come out and hike and hunt and fish and enjoy the areas.
When I learned about this project today, one thing that really caught my attention was this new property that's near the Cussawagga Creek is going to be available for hunters.
It is, yes. Yep. So the Cats Natural Area is 5 minutes north of Meadville. You can see it from Route 98 or access it. We have a parking lot there on 98 and also on Rogers Ferry Road. And then if you go a little bit farther north, we have the Cussawagga Bottom Conservation Area, also along Cussawagga Creek, and there's 120 acres there for people to go out and use. So yes, hunting is permitted there.
So we're going to hear from a number of people today about different things, about organizations all that have going to help put this all together, and some biology. We're going to hear about some of those kind of things too.
Exactly. So we have several professionals here. We have biologists from both the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and Ducks Unlimited. So they'll be talking as we're on the bus and stopping at the properties, and at the Cats Natural Area we're going to take a hike. So we'll learn more about what's there and what we're seeing as we're traveling along.
Well, looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thanks for having us.
Charles Beer is our Senior Director of Conservation Science, and he is one of our best experts about the ecological values of French Creek. This is one of the most important places that we work in all Western Pennsylvania in terms of ecological value. So I'm going to turn it over to this expert to tell us more.
Good morning. Okay, yeah, so I'll just try to share a few things with you about the watershed and the conservation in this area as we go along. And again, if there are questions later on, we can talk one-on-one or in small groups to address those. The first thing I'll mention is a little bit about the history, though. I don't know how many people are actually familiar with the watershed itself, but pardon me? Oh, we're going past the Halliday property that adjoins Game Lands 277 right now. So this is the first project. We're going to go down the road here and then turn left on Miller Station Road and go up a short distance. So everything you see on the left, almost until we turn around, is part of this project. And the property is also on the right. And this was originally part of the Cambridge Springs Inn property. The inn burned down a few years ago. You may have heard of that. You can see the wetlands on the left and right there. And this will be one of the few chances you have to see French Creek itself, which is off on the right. Just now beyond the trees, a short distance, you're looking at the floodplain to French Creek, and the stream is just off to the right there. For much of the rest of the trip, we will be in other parts of the watershed and not directly along French Creek. That is on the right of Fish and Boat Commission access to boating access to French Creek. and now we're in the game land itself.
Turn around here.
We're going to the second.
Oh, second.
Yeah, because we can see more water and then going back.
Oops, my bad.
Notice off to the right some of the wetlands, a lot of spatterdock in there in the floodplain again of French Creek. We'll go up here and just turn around, and then you'll get another look at it on the way back. What I was going to mention a little bit about the history, if you're interested in that. I always like to know about the history of the landscape that I'm working in, because it really does relate a lot to conservation. In this case, way back though, the French were the first Europeans to come to this area, and when they got here, the story is that they saw a lot of bison standing in the creek. Here we see some water control impoundments. So they actually named French Creek Rivière au Boeuf, which means river of the beef. They didn't know what the bison really were, so they just used the word for cow to describe them. So that was the first word for French Creek, and it was actually George Washington, when he first came here in 1753 to ask the French to leave, that it was then he started referring to the creek as French Creek. And they're not too far from here, there's the town of Waterford on LeBoeuf Lake LeBoeuf, and it's a short distance off of French Creek, but there was a French fort there, and George was sent by the governor of Virginia, Governor Dinwiddie, to ask the French to leave this area because it was being claimed by King George. The French put George up and Christopher Gist up for his accompanist for a few days, and then just asked them to politely leave, and they rejected the offer. And that was actually the beginning of the French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, which was the beginning of setting up kind of the founding of the United States. So that was the point where the British and the French contested much of the United States, especially up in this area and along what they call the Forks of the Ohio, where Pittsburgh sits right now. So yeah, it was that whole initial interaction between the French and the British that sort of set up the beginning of the United States. So kind of key. So yes, George Washington did sleep here. And there's a little plaque in Cambridge Springs, a town that we're nearby, that indicates that. There was a particular trail that he used, an Indian trail that he used to get up to Fort LeBoeuf to talk to the French, and it came right through the town. A little bit more about the French Creek Watershed. It is a stream that begins in southwestern New York in Chautauqua County. Here are the wetlands again on the Halliday property.
Here and go down towards Venango. Yeah. Okay.
The river then travels 117 miles and enters the Allegheny River at the town of Franklin in Venango County, Pennsylvania. There are 4 different counties involved with the watershed of French Creek, and the whole watershed is about 1,270 square miles, and that's roughly 712 5,000 acres of land. Knowing all of those facts are kind of important to us that work in conservation, because we're interested in protecting the biodiversity of the watershed, and we really can't do that in kind of the typical land trust practice of going to a place and protecting a piece of property and then doing little projects here and there. We're taking an entire watershed perspective in trying to maintain the biodiversity of this small river that's known as French Creek. And that's why this collaborative is also so important, and working with the governmental agencies, we just need that much effort to get this job done. We're about to cross the creek up here at this bridge. You'll notice this part of French Creek is interesting in a way. It's one of the parts of the creek that's actually very sluggish, and because of the terrain and the description of the landscape here, this creek goes from areas that basically are what we call riffle run habitat, or places where the river's really moving pretty good, to other areas such as this one, where the stream has been basically thwarted in its effort to cut down through the landscape and create a fall, and so there's a very sluggish area right in here. This creates a different kind of habitat, of course. It's deep, the bottom is rather silty, but in other areas where the riffle run habitat occurs, you find a very different diversity of aquatic life. French Creek being known for the freshwater mussels in particular, and the diversity of freshwater fishes. And those are largely found in a variety of habitats, but especially in these riffle run environments. It's interesting to think about this watershed in terms of how large it is. Parts of 4 counties, over 700,000 acres of land, 1,270 square miles, 117 miles of river flowage. I'm mentioning those figures again because before you get lunch, there is a quiz, so you have to pass in order to get lunch.
You better take notes.
So it's very important that we have a lot of conservation effort here, because in some ways the general conservation that's happened in Pennsylvania has in some ways overlooked this whole region of Pennsylvania. What I mean by that is, other than the Pennsylvania Game Commission, which does own tens of thousands of acres of land in this large watershed, there's basically no other state-owned land in the watershed. And to have a big chunk of Pennsylvania this size without any state parks and almost no state forest land, that's very unusual. Normally, there would be thousands of acres of state park land and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of acres of state forest land in a watershed in Pennsylvania this size. So there is Erie National Wildlife Refuge, which is over 8,000 acres, and that's within the French Creek drainage. But in terms of the typical pattern of conservation lands in Pennsylvania, there's very little of that up in this area. Part of that, I think, has to do with the fact that the soils up here are very good for farming, and the landscape essentially has been dominated by agriculture over time. So instead of having a landscape with a lot of vacant land, such as mountaintops or high plateau areas, there's very sort of fragmented ownership of the land in this area, and a lot of it was in agriculture. So it made conservation projects very difficult to do. In other places, we've created state forests and national forests by going into areas that are fairly remote and not so many people in them, using land for various other human activities, and we're able to purchase parcels of land that were several thousand acres in just one project, and that was not possible here in the French Creek Watershed. The watershed is very good for agriculture and also growing timber because it is a glaciated landscape. So this area was sitting under a mile-thick ice sheet some 20,000 years ago. That ice sheet was starting to retract back north, and it left a lot of debris and soil building materials here on the landscape that made the soil very buffered with limestone and created a very good environment for farming to take place. Crossing French Creek here again, you can see the water's moving right here quite a bit more. In fact, off to the left is a property that's owned by the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy called Venango Riffle, and it's named for that in-stream habitat that is so important for freshwater fishes and mussels, and also our biggest salamander, the hellbender. This is a good example of the landscape that has been glaciated. You notice that it's just a gently rolling set of hills. And if you're not familiar with glacial geology, let me share with you that you can be on the lookout for some evidence that the glacier was last here 20,000 years ago. That particular ice sheet was known as the Wisconsin glaciation. But if you watch as we're driving along, you might see huge rounded boulders sitting off to the sides of the road or next to somebody's house. And if you see some of these, I'll try to find some and point them out. We'll see some later at the Katz property, but these are called glacial erratics. And what the geologists tell us is that these big boulders were brought out of Canada, and they're usually granite. And they were rounded off by being rolled by the glacier and having a lot of water flowing over them, and they were kind of pulverized by the sand and the gravel flowing in streams. And they were brought hundreds of miles into this area out of Canada. There is no native granite produced here in northwestern Pennsylvania. So these are very interesting large boulders that people would find when they would go to dig their basements to build their houses, or when a road would be built. You see one? Oh, yes, and there are goats in the watershed. Come on, help me out. You see any glacial erratics here? Okay, look at the goats. Those are glaciated goats. Notice how they're largely white. Here's a glacial erratic on the right, sitting right along the edge of the road there. See that? You notice that they're often pink colored because the feldspar that's found in granite is one of the major components of granite. Along with all of that granite material came a lot of limestone too. I was mentioning that before. And the limestone that was brought down out of Canada into this area has really created a lot of the ecological description of this area. So, for example, a lot of the wetlands that are found in the French Creek drainage are calcareous or alkaline. The pH is high, and that means they're very productive. They grow plants easily, and they also have a rich diversity of flora, a vegetation that you do not find in many other places in Pennsylvania. This limestone in the soil eventually makes its way into the streams of the French Creek drainage and into French Creek itself. And the limestone, the calcium, is very good at providing material for the mollusks to build their shells. And that's one of the reasons that there's so many freshwater mussels in this area, and their populations are very high. There are 5 species of freshwater mussels in French Creek that are listed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as being either endangered species or threatened. And some of these have declined by 95% of their ranges in the United States. In French Creek, along with the Allegheny River, are some of their last best populations for things like the snuff box, the northern riffle shell, the club shell, and the rayed bean mussel. Also found here is the rabbit's foot. You can see the mussels have kind of interesting names. And there's a total diversity of over 24 species of freshwater mussels in French Creek and its tributaries. Just to give you a little more information on the conservation lands in the watershed, Tom Saunders, our president of the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, mentioned earlier that we have protected now over 5,000 acres of land in the watershed. We actually started that work back in 1969 with our first protection project, which was called Wattsburg Fen Natural Area. And a fen is a special kind of wetland that has, again, that very high pH and supports very unusual species. But in terms of other conservation lands, I mentioned that the Game Commission has been very active in French Creek as really the main governmental conservation entity, and there are over 33,000 acres of game lands in the French Creek watershed. I mentioned Erie National Wildlife Refuge with about 8,800 acres creating that refuge. Also, the French Creek Valley Conservancy has been working on a number of projects and now has almost 2,000 acres of land protected in this watershed. Allegheny Valley Conservancy has protected 800 acres. Prescott Audubon Society has been involved in a wetland that has protected 109 acres. So those are some examples of the other conservation partners and organizations that have been working on this protection over time. Okay, we're coming up to our Cussawago Bottoms property. This will be our first stop, so we're in the Cussawago Valley. Obviously, we'll be meeting some other people here. Thank you for your attention. It was a pleasure riding with you, and again, if you have any questions throughout the day, look me up. I'll be happy to talk to you. Thanks again.
So I'm quite familiar with this area for my whole life, and this particular property I probably would have become acquainted with about the 1950s. This was a farm. There was a farmhouse right behind us here. There was a barn right about in here. And I went to school with the children who lived here. And this site today is a remarkably rich site for birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians. You can see this big pond here. Beyond the brush, further back, is another larger pond, and so it's quite rich. And what's remarkable about this site to me is that as recently as 30-40 years ago, you would have looked at this place and thought, no way we're going to invest in conservation here. You know, it's an active farm. And Ann Sand's got a handout she's going to pass around to you. and you'll see on the back side a top photo. The top photo is from 1939. It's an aerial photo, and it shows, except for the forest to the south there, it shows this entire area as farm ground. Now the higher ground would have been cultivated row crops, principally corn and oats and some hay. The lower wetter ground would have been pasture. And so you would have looked at this and back then and thought, no way would you invest for wildlife here, because this place is kind of lost, it's developed. But it's testimony to what happens if you, in this area where you've got pretty good soils and a lot of water, if you just leave some of the land alone, it can heal itself. And it was healed primarily with the help of beavers. There was a little road that went along, a farm track went along the woods there. You could drive all the way back through there. Today it'd be a tough walk in your hip boots. But anyway, the beavers came in here some years ago and started damming up the old drainage ditches. If you look on that aerial photo, and even on this one, you can see the remnants of drainage ditches that went through here and went through there. And so without too much trouble here, nature's bringing this place back. And it's already good for waterfowl. There are about 4 species of waterfowl known to nest around here. Hooded mergansers and wood ducks nest here, Canada geese, mallards. And in the spring you can find quite a few migrants dropping in here. Ringneck ducks, for some reason, seem to like it a lot. And in the spring I've seen tundra swan land here. And that always amazes me, because when you think of where they've come from, generally the Chesapeake area, they've come all the way across Pennsylvania, stopped here, and they're headed to the Arctic in northern Canada, or maybe even on into Alaska. So quite remarkable that there's a habitat here, Cussawauga Township, Cussawauga Bottoms, Crawford County, that supports wildlife like that. And it's also quite good around here for turkeys. Well, a lot of wild turkey here, a lot of deer. I just saw a deer this morning walk onto the property down there. And so what once was an intensively farmed area here, that was its initial purpose, was agriculture. Now today the outdoor recreation is the principal use of this property. It gets hunted quite a bit. I see a guy or two here who likes to come over here during the waterfowl season, and I haven't seen very many people coming to bird watch, but eventually as the word gets out, people will find this as a birding destination. I've been keeping a running list until you came here, and I'm already way over 20 species, so it's great. And I really appreciate, because I love this area so much, I grew up here, I really appreciate the support that all of you give the various organizations that in turn made this acquisition possible. And you're gonna enjoy your visit here, and it's going to get even better at the next stop down at the Cats natural area towards Meadville. That is a real gem, 500 plus acres. It's hard to pull together contiguous property like that. And we'll have a wonderful walk down along the creek down there. You'll get close to the creek there. The creek itself, Cussawauga, is that way quite a way beyond those tall trees down there. So anyway, thank you for your support and for coming out on this cool windy morning. Hopefully it doesn't rain, but either way we're going to have a good time. Thanks. If anybody has any questions, I'll take them for a minute or two.
Yeah, you got time.
Jim's ready to say something here.
Yeah, certainly. Anybody questions, sir?
In the scheme of migratory routes, is that figured into these properties when you look at these things, that something like this, as you spoke of the tundra swans, is that part of this discussion in looking at properties, or is that something that they just happen to be here?
Well, they just happen to be here, but it's well known that this area is good for migratory birds, and I doubt that somebody did an analysis of what species are migrating when. However, this valley, this Cussawauga Bottom, has 3 important, what I'll call, official designations. One is that Audubon, Pennsylvania has designated it as one of the important bird areas in Pennsylvania. That's drawn a lot of attention to it. The other is going back to that North American Waterfowl Management Plan, and I encourage all of you to go online, Google it, look it up, and see just how massive this plan is, covering everything from Canada to US to Mexico. The plan has several what they call joint ventures under it, regional joint ventures where various entities, agencies, etc. Cooperate in waterfowl conservation. Under that plan, under its Atlantic Coast Joint Venture, seems a stretch to be related here, but it is, they have several focus areas in Pennsylvania, and one of the sub-focus areas is this Cussawago Bottom. So when you get a designation like Audubon's important bird areas, sub-focus area under the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, bingo, that gets the attention of agencies and funders. You know, it says that somebody else has found this area to be very important. And I should point out a third source of information that's invaluable in these kinds of acquisitions, and that's the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program, which the Western Pennsylvania Conservancies had a great deal to do with. And in these county heritage programs, periodically over a few years, there are intensive surveys of important wildlife and plant fauna. And the Heritage Plan for Crawford County, I think, lists, if I'm right, Charles, I think lists 3 areas of high biological diversity in the Cussawago watershed. So yes, maybe not specifically analyzing the tundra swan's migration pattern, but survey-based data on wildlife and plants play heavily into the conservation priorities here.
John, could you mention a little bit about the fish in Cussawago Creek?
Yeah, the creek is also very rich with fish. Now, we've all heard of French Creek and how great French Creek is, and indeed it is. French Creek has close to 100 species of fish in it. Well, I'm presently involved with a survey of fishes in Cussawago, and adding my findings to the findings of others, DEP, Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, Allegheny College. I think we're now documenting over 50 species of fish that occur in this watershed. And I haven't surveyed around these ponds yet, but I already know that there's several species of fish that have come in. It's good for pan fishing here. It's good for largemouth bass fishing here. And downstream from these ponds here, the 2 large ones here, if you went downstream with the outflow beyond the beaver dams, this small stream, it's unnamed, it drains into a series of beaver-maintained wetlands that end at Cussawago Creek on my farm. And interestingly, last year I did a little surveying at the outflow of this place here, and I discovered 2 state endangered species right there on my farm. And one of them is there, it's on your handout. They're both on your handout. One's a redfin shiner. Cussawago Creek's been long known as the place in Pennsylvania for redfin shiners. But I also caught a small kind of a sunfish called a warmouth. And they're rather uncommon in Pennsylvania, endangered, and weren't known to occur in Cussawago until I caught them right at the outflow of this wetland complex. So this is a rich area, and I hope that working together we can do more work in the valley here. It's great.
Yeah, so kind of elaborate that from a protection standpoint. You know, French Creek is kind of the set boundaries of this initiative, but beyond that, there's a lot of things that go into that fine-tune where it is that we specifically work. We're not talking about protecting any sort of properties within the French Creek watershed. There are regions that are specific, and this happens to be the Cussawago Bottoms be one of those that is very important to all the organizations that are here represented today. And some of those that are not, that, you know, essentially these are some of the partners that were listed in this acquisition. So, you know, the IBA, he listed, you know, over 200 species of birds utilize the Cussawago Bottoms area as an area for breeding, migratory, or wintering. This whole area, if you zoom out on a map, is pretty obvious to see. the landscape form. Essentially, it's a ameliorated channel, which is a fancy word for saying it's just braided and kind of goes in and out of undefined bed and bank areas. So it's an expansive wetland, kind of somewhat similar to Geneva Swamp, a little bit different, or Geneva Marsh, but it's a little bit different in its composition, but it's still a large complex of a wetland system that we're actively looking at protecting. Pretty much the entire thing is the eventual goal. And John's being modest, but he's already offered to eventually turn the properties over to some of the organizations here and upon his passing. So he's been actively a part of this whole process, getting this property started. But certainly.
My wife and I own 3 parcels totaling about 210 acres on Cusawago Creek, and it's our intention before we pass on to have all those properties conserved in perpetuity.
So I'd be remiss without saying that this property, it was kind of the start, the culmination of this partnership between all the agencies and organizations. French Creek and WPC were active, very active in this area long before DU got involved. But this property really started it all, and I'd be remiss without acknowledging 2 of the people that decided not to introduce themselves at the meeting. Jim Lang in the back, you want to, and Brenda. So these 2 are from French Creek Valley Conservancy. They're going to be talking about some properties that we're working with them over lunch. So, but they're certainly were the start of this, and actually it was John, myself, Brenda, and well, actually, but it was Jim and Dave. Yeah, some of you may remember from the earlier days of French Creek Valley Conservancy, but we're certainly glad Brenda's on board and has done great work so far. But this property was really the culmination which started this whole thing that we're about to see. And kind of what's made it unique is we had the opportunity to overlay mission statements that directly align and be able to do the same activities for slightly different reasons. French Creek being the importance for the fisheries and the mussels and that standpoint from the 2 other organizations mainly working here. The wetlands being importance for Ducks Unlimited, but kind of what we've been able to do with this, and it's kind of the nicest part about the whole thing, is essentially we've basically developed a revolving lands fund. So what do I mean by that? Essentially, the money that was initially put together to acquire this property was all private funds, mostly from many of you standing here, your support and everything that went into this property. All the volunteer work, all the fundraising, all the efforts that you do, the monetary gifts, the time, the hours, and everything else. After that, we were able to take that money and leverage it toward 2 separate grants. Western PA Conservancy first went after Department of Natural Resource Conservation Service grant, which Aaron is a part of. So essentially they gave us sort of the first pot of funds, which covered 50% of the acquisition costs. Then I took the other portion of that match and leveraged it towards the North American Wetland Conservation Act grant. Essentially the funding that was born out of the North American Wetland Management Plan that John and his team and others had initially put together some years ago. Where now if you put the math together, we've got a lot of different sources of funding. How does that all come together? Well, essentially what we've been able to do is take the state funding and leverage that towards the match being the match towards the federal grant, and the federal grant was matched towards the state grant. Now it's not 100%, but essentially what happened was we were to take those 2 grant sources, leverage them towards each other, and get reimbursed for the acquisition of the property to get that money back that you all worked so hard to raise for this organization and others to do it again. And we've done that now 3 times. So it's not 100%, and obviously not. And this is how we continue to work together as an organization. And as we go on, the hope is that we'll continue to be able to do that. But obviously, not all the times everything's going to line up. But by and large, many of your funding has already been leveraged 6 or 7 times to bring money back, and it is coming back to the organizations to do it again. So that's the kind of the gold standards of what we call leveraging funding opportunities. But it's been one that we've been really successful at here in whole French Creek Watershed initiative, you know, the part of the initiative and why we're working together. So.
Yeah, you combine that then, little low per acre cost if you're playing the Northwest Pennsylvania. That's a lot of bang for the buck.
Yeah, certainly. So, you know, as much as we're all here together celebrating the organizations, it really starts with you guys, and that's how important it is. You know, the funding that you provide to this organization and others is really the seed that starts the whole thing. So, you know, as much as you want to thank any of us, we thank you as much. But with that, you know, we have our newly dedication sign that lists a lot of our partners, so many of which are here today. The DCNR here, Fish and Wildlife Service. I guess John's our sort of interim rep, being retired from the Fish and Wildlife Service. You know, National Wild Turkey Federation is one. They've also given to this particular project. So we have some other partners that will be involved with some of the other ones. But essentially, we started that main sort of partnership with Western PA Conservancy, French Creek Valley Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited. But we've been growing that, and there's already a collaborative that's in place, and Tom Saunders is going to talk about that in a little while, at the next property that we'll see. So I won't elaborate too much on that. But essentially, this property is, you know, others may have suggested, is open to pretty much any sort of recreational activity other than those that would be damaging to the environment. So ATVs, any sort of mobile sort of machinery is typically not allowed on these preserves and game lands. So yeah, I don't have a map with me on me, but there's a nice map here. You know, go ahead and take a look at this. Essentially, what I had showed with the first property looked at, if you were to look at some of the maps that we put together, this property would be the same scenario. It'd be all dash, slash, bolded, colored. Basically, it's all different types of wetland habitats, pretty much up until you get to the point of this tree line. You walk out there and pretty much be stepping in a wetland and get wet feet. So, yeah.
Very good.
Anything else? Anybody else care to say anything more? Ann, you're being shy. You were part of this. Do you have anything to say about the process, the acquisition? Put them on the spot.
Well,
So in your package too, there's details about each one of these properties. So, you know, there's a little bit more, maybe some traps that we missed, but trying to catch the high points.
all I have to say is, when we first started working with Ducks Unlimited, Jim Figge came down, took a look at the property. He said he didn't think it was wet enough. He was a little concerned. So our watershed staff did a wetlands delineation of this property, and what did we find out?
So yeah, essentially, if you go on any sort of aerial
We
mapping,
found out it was really wet.
yeah. Yeah, so essentially if you go on aerial mapping, there's different tools that are out there, and they're tools, they're used to at least evaluate what types of wetlands are on the landscape. They're somewhat limited in a lot of cases, and you know, not to elaborate too much on that, but essentially it's the National Wetland Inventory. So it's kind of a government-funded aerial photography and imagery that sort of delineates or sets boundaries on wetlands throughout North America. It's a good tool, it's a good start, but you know, me in my past, you know, being wetland, I used to do wetland delineations for an environmental consulting firm before coming to Ducks Unlimited. I took one look at that property, and basically the only thing they listed was in the tree line and basically a little bit of, maybe it was like 50 acres out of the whole 100. And so as part of the NACA grant, you know, one of the things is it's all about wetland conservation. And I said there's no way that that's the actual boundary of these wetlands. So that was, we had WPC actually brought out some of their staff, one of which was one of the gentlemen who I trained when I was at the other organization. He then went to WPC, and you know, I got to get him out in the field for once, which he was happy to get out. And essentially that boundary was extended pretty much almost to the edge of this tree line here. It kind of goes up on a little bit further you go towards the right here, but pretty much everything that you see is all different types of wetland habitat. So
it's a great project, and we were happy to partner with Ducks Unlimited and many other partners in this project.
I got something to say. When I first heard about this, I wanted to check it out.
So the first thing, and I see several people in the crowd did the same thing. We walked this property line out that way. That is real bad. It is real thick in there. I saw a deer back in there, and I don't think I ever saw a human being. But I walked the whole way around, and there's a path that goes right along that edge and goes right into the nice woods. So if you check it out, go that way.
Since we have you captive on the bus again, we thought we would talk a little bit about the French Creek Collaborative, the organization that brings together the different conservation groups to work in this area. Can everybody hear okay? So, as you've seen, there are a number of partners who work up in the French Creek area, and if we all did this independently, I think our work would be sort of scattershot. So we now have an entity called the French Creek Collaborative, very informal. Brenda, and Jim, we're in our 8th year, I think. And the collaborative is made up of the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, French Creek Valley Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, Audubon, and the Nature Conservancy. And particularly we three in PEC, Pennsylvania Environmental Council. Don't tell them I forgot them. And so particularly among the land conservation organizations, we work collectively to prioritize what properties we want to protect, and then we divide up the work among the different organizations. We also work collectively to seek out funding, and as Jim mentioned earlier, there's a lot of leveraging of the funding. For any contributions made to any of the organizations, we're pulling in a lot of additional funds. I'm going to pass this to Sean Fenlon to tell us a little bit about just about how the collaborative is organized and how we prioritize the properties we protect. I set up some good feedback for you.
Yeah, thanks. Hold on the side here.
Yeah.
All right, this is impromptu, so forgive me if I kind of ramble here a little bit. Well, I'd say in terms of the properties that we focus on, of course, the whole watershed is our focus. But within there are particular places that are most important to us. Particularly, of course, is French Creek itself, and Charles is following behind us. I'm sure he wants to shout out the real truth about French Creek. But French Creek has, as I've heard him say, up to 88 species of freshwater fish. I think it's 26 species of freshwater mussels, 5 which are federally listed, so not a small number by any measure. What we've often said, and when we talk to our board, is that this particular stream has more biological diversity than any other stream of its size from here all the way up through the rest of the northeastern United States. So it's important for that reason alone. It gets a lot of our attention. But beyond that, there are a couple other things. I mean, there are some important bird areas, and of course the wetlands that Jim Figge was talking about earlier. And then last of all, I think there's some important values here for what's kind of what PEC and now FCVC have driven, which is, sorry, I should say French Creek Valley Conservancy, but a lot of acronyms in our field. These two organizations have pushed the idea of making it economically smart for these local communities to actually be interested in the conservation of what's here, and what gets interest of organizations like DU, and which of course is national, and WPC. A lot of people think it's Pittsburgh based, but it's not. And so as a result of that, we have all these kind of different focuses that we're really driving what we're doing. And I know Brenda and Jim, you'll be talking later about some of that, but I think that's important to mention that to the extent you can have Venango and Cambridge Springs and Sagertown very interested in this at their local community level, it makes a big difference. And you guys will, again, Brenda and Jim will talk about that more later. So in general, I would say WPC's interest has been along what we call those biological diversity driven factors. And in particular, we've actually mapped out what we think are some of the most important places in the entire watershed. And I know we've shared that with FCVC, we've shared it, I think with DU, it's kind of no secret. We all kind of let each other know where those are. But the main ones are, of course, French Creek itself. In addition to French Creek, you have where we are right now, the Cussawago is one of the key ones. But then also there's the West Branch French Creek and the South Branch French Creek. LaBeouf Creek, and a couple others, I think Conneautee, and we literally map all these out parcel by parcel based upon what Charles would call, you can ask about, you can quiz him later, he'll be really impressed. If you ask him, Charles, what is the active river area? And he'll just like, my God, these people actually listen to me. But the active river area is something he talks about a lot, is kind of driving a lot of our focus on maintaining that high water quality of French Creek and all these other key tributaries. Lastly, I would mention that we've also protected some what we call natural heritage areas that are biologically important, irrespective of French Creek and these main tributaries. So, for example, you all know probably, or a lot of you from this area know of Lake Pleasant. That's really has a lot of fascinating things going on there. A lot of important plants, and it's actually what we hear is the best example of a glacial lake left in all of really northwest Pennsylvania. My understanding is that all of western Pennsylvania there are only 8 true natural lakes. Everything else, of course, is streams and rivers. So really, I'd say for us, it's kind of a combination of factors, and I wish I could get Jim or Brenda to come up here while we're driving and talk about some of what you guys do, but you'll have a chance to talk later. So just kind of a mix of things, and the result has been fantastic. I mean, put you on the spot, French Creek Valley Conservancy has protected, what, something like 10 to 15 properties just in the last 5 years or so, 6 years, you know, it's a lot. I mean, and this is just viscerally for me because we're all talking about this, right? We talk about it all the time. We meet every 3 months as a group and we just talk through what our priorities are and how we're doing and, you know, where we need to change what we're doing, and it works out really quite well. Other thoughts, Tom?
It's good.
Okay. All right, well, I think we're about
halfway there.
About halfway there, so we got about 10 more minutes. And if anybody sees for sale signs, please let us know.
No buildings.
This is the heart of where we're working right now. So, all right, well, thanks all.
Thank you, Sean. This is our Cats Natural Area, and the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy fundraises in lots of different ways. We operate mostly from individual donations and gifts from foundations. But the story of Ms. Katz's gift to us is kind of incredible for us. She was a registered nurse, and she was she liked conservation. She was a member of our organization for more than 20 years, and she contributed $100 every year, never more than $100 during her lifetime. And then I can still remember the day when we got the word that she had put us in her will, and she had left us $5 million, which for our organization is still the biggest individual gift we have ever received from anyone. And I can remember where I was in a car with the person who then ran land conservation. We were driving to Washington, D.C., and we never have enough money for any of the projects we do. So to have a $5 million gift was extraordinary for us. But she donated it to us to use for acquisition of natural areas, meaning places of special ecological and habitat significance. And so we have used that gift over and over. We essentially revolve it. We use it for one property, and then we try to fundraise from other sources to bring money back in, and then put it toward the next property. And we have been able to protect more than 20 properties so far with this gift from her. So when we bought this one, we named it for her, and we called it the Cats Natural Area. It was just under 300 acres initially, this first property that we bought from a Mr. Smock who owned it. And then the way we often work is to keep adding on to land. So we've bought an additional property that way, an additional property that way. And so the Cats Natural Area is now 550 acres. And we did this as usual with state partners, other funding partners. Ducks Unlimited has helped us with NAWCA grants for some of these properties. And I don't know where Tyson is, but Tyson's going to lead us on a hike in just a second. He does all the management and stewardship work on this property, so he knows it well. But I'll kill time till we find Tyson, since he's leading our hike. I'm going to pass to you, Jim, because I know you have a few comments from DU's perspective.
Yeah, so you know, it's many more partners. We've been talking about the core folks, but there's been additions every time we get, you know, bigger and bigger with this group. So some of those, I think Bob Schoenfeld, I don't believe he's here. He was Crawford County Federation of Sportsmen's Club. I believe there's a rep in his place. Is anybody still here from them? Sir, thank you for your support. You know, there's other organizations that have been involved. You know, like I said, Turkey Federation, North American Wetland Conservation Act funding, some of the other projects that we have very close to here, Northwest PA Duck Hunters Association. Am I missing anybody? Well, so certainly one that's, they're not quite as active in here, but we've been able to work with them, the Nature Conservancy. Essentially, some of their properties they have currently in ownership are looking to transfer those as they kind of pull out of the French Creek Watershed. They're looking to transfer a lot of those to FCVC as well as WPC, not exactly the combination, but essentially me being the I don't know, I've heard good and bad names about it, but the wizard with money, essentially those donations, when they turn them over to the other agency, that's also in many federal cases viewed as a protection component, because essentially they're liquidating assets to pull out of an area that's still of importance. Now they're not opening it up for the public to acquire, but still it's a protection to turn it over to some entity to ensure that it's protected in perpetuity. That action, essentially, that donation in itself is matchable through grants. Free match, both in acres and in dollars. So the value of that property on appraisal is actually what we're using in certain cases and will be using to acquire other properties. This one in particular is one that we've used. Where's Anna? Is this one of the ones that we used? The other? No, that was Halliday. Yeah, so the Halliday piece, the first piece property that you saw, we used another acquisition that WPC had done like a year or two prior, the Nicknar property. When I had the map up, you saw two properties, and I didn't actually explain the other one. The other one was an older acquisition, but essentially we used that value of the land since it was acquired prior to kind of DU getting involved. We used that one. We were able to backtrack. You can count back like 2 years essentially to account those acquisitions as match, and we're kind of facilitating that. And then the Slozat, or we didn't use the Skidudo property yet, right? That'll be, so there's a property within, we got so many that we're using in our back pockets now, doing facilitated donations and transfers. One of which is over by Geneva Swamp that is currently under WPC ownership. It's called the Skidudo property, and essentially that'll be eventually transferred over to the Pennsylvania Game Commission, correct? So when that happens, the value of that property will be transferred and used towards more acquisitions. So this particular property that we acquired, at least the portion that, the latest acquisition, which is, hard to see with the boundaries, but essentially it's this whole bottomlands area of the property. Essentially it's about 161 acres, I believe, total. There again, if you looked at that on the mapping that we created, it would be entirely bolded / dashed, basically highlighted 100% wetland habitats, all bottomland, hardwoods, beaver sloughs, emergent, submergent wetland habitats, forested wetlands. It's really an incredible piece that I don't get enough time to enjoy. I'd love to come up here more, but being that I cover such a large area, I don't get to always enjoy them as much as I like. But anyway, Phil Pooks is with our organization. He's been has a long history within Pennsylvania, native from Pennsylvania, Titusville area. He's also got a few words to kind of talk about the organization as well as his kind of personal feelings for this area and property.
Impromptu, like so much of today. Just a question, how many of you folks are hunters or fishermen? Always good to know. I mean, that, for those of you that appreciate all this, we know that it's important that you have a connection to the land, and that connection can be through taking of game, things along those lines. I can probably rest assured that all of you are the folks in the belief that when you shot something, you took it home, you used it, you ate it, you do that kind of stuff to it. Never took any of it for granted, otherwise chances are we wouldn't be here today doing this kind of stuff. My hat's off to everybody in that regard. That speaks volumes, not just because if you're not a hunter fisherman, it doesn't mean you have any less love for the land, But certainly in our country, that has been a big part of our interaction with the outdoors over generations, and we know how that's changing on us. And it's so important that we work together as groups to be able to pull off these kind of projects. That's pretty profound. You look at an organization like Ducks Unlimited, I mean, this is great. Jim, Tom, everybody. Jim, the stuff that's gone on with putting together this consortium of folks speaks volumes to just exactly that. There are many things that we are together, that we on as far as protecting land that doesn't necessarily have to. We may be adversarial in some degrees about the different ways to protect it, but we all are involved in the process of finding a way to do that. These things coming together as they are through the work, particularly of Jim with the French Creek Conservancy, hounding us, I think is pulling us together to make sure that we have a chance to take advantage of an opportunity like this to make these programs and projects much bigger, encompassing entire watersheds is pretty profound. DU as an organization, as those of you that are volunteers, which I certainly see a lot of folks here that have spent time with us, know that we are community-based, but we cover all kinds of stuff. The work that the Conservancy does, we're very much involved in the same kind of things, acquisition of lands, easements, things along those lines. So we don't hold fee title, we're in the same vein of what Jim talks about, is once it's acquired, let's find an appropriate entity to maintain it so we can move on to the next project. That's just so key to what we do. What's the basis of all that? You folks are, as members, as major donors to any of the organizations that are here. It is that component that when we talk about finding matches with the government agencies, that's what they look at. Who's supporting you? Are you in depth in the communities in which you're attempting to serve? And you folks obviously represent that. And so all I can say is thank you for that kind of stuff. I mean, DU as an organization is continental. I mean, from the Boreal Forest Initiative to the Mexican Yucatan Peninsula, it's 14 million acres now that we've managed to maintain, now continue to maintain, but are responsible for either acquisition, restoration, or enhancement of those properties. So it's no small feat, but none of that would have been possible without volunteers at local levels who connect us with our communities and bring us together to be able to do things like this. So all I can say is thank you for that. And for me, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, this is pretty special to come home to this part of the world, and I love to come back here. My wife doesn't want to come back. She's a southern girl now, but there will be 3 months of the year when retirement rolls around that yours truly will be stomping around these woods when that all comes about in a handful of years, because it is such a beautiful place, as you all know. I wouldn't trade it for the world. My upbringing here and everything else that is connected to me is me. Created the way I feel about the work that I do for DU and for conservation and for wildlife and habitat in general. I'd like to say it's an honor and a pleasure to be with people who care. Pretty special. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. So, yeah, I mean, we're kind of, at this point, kind of filling in some gaps with different things, so other people have things they'd like to say. I know there's some within our organization, Ducks Unlimited, so Bob Gernarmo, he's a pretty active volunteer here in the local area. Good friend and fellow commiserate that we work together on a lot of these things. So,
well, I'm new to this acquisition stuff, and this is just great. I know all of you appreciate it, but our kids and our grandkids, that's what this is for, and it is just super. Well, let me tell you about some things we've done. Up at the other property, we've put up some wood duck boxes, and we got them up late last year, and we did have some success. I saw my first blue jay nest in one of them. We had eggs in one, they didn't hatch, and a couple of them that were in the woods I thought would be the best ones, and there wasn't anything in them. So that was a start. We're going to do them here too. But this property, this is a super property. If you take the hike, where's Tyson?
Hi,
See this here? That's the way the whole path is. He maintains it. It's great. You don't have to wear boots or anything. It goes way back to this beaver pond, and the beaver pond's pretty neat too. In fact, I've hunted that beaver pond. I've hunted the beaver ponds up at the last property we're at, and I am quite a conservationist, because I didn't get anything. And there's a big pond out off of the main road there, And boy, I had my eye on that pond all winter. And as soon as ice went out, I went down there fishing. And it's beautiful, crystal clear, you can see everything there. And again, I didn't get anything. But I gotta tell you something else. I don't know, maybe I'm stealing Tyson's thunder, but I come down here and there's a brand new picnic table there, wheelchair accessible. And so Tyson told me that it's a Boy Scout project. And it's one of the Boy Scouts from Cambridge Springs, where I live. And he did a nice job there, and they did some painting there, so it was just super. And when I was here the other day, this was all flooded. It was really cool. So check it all out. I think you'll really enjoy it.
Thank you, Bob.
We do our hiking right here?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So I think at this point we're kind of getting ready. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, which is good. Gives you more time to look around. You know, like I said, many people will see that seen this property is by far one of my favorites so far that we've protected. So you know, please take the time, enjoy it. You know, Tyson's going to talk a little bit about the management and upkeeps of the properties that WPC has protected, and so the ongoing maintenance. But yeah, it's good property to see.
So the hike's just about half a mile, and our fearless guide is making his way to the front.
All right, so again, my name's Tyson Johnson. I'm the Land Stewardship Coordinator for the Conservancy in the Northwest region. I actually live just outside of Meadville, but I man our office in Franklin, which we just opened in the past 2 years or so. So I'm going to talk more on the bus on our way back to the golf course about the stewardship, the management that we've done to these properties. But I'm going to lead us on a short hike here and talk about some of what you'll be seeing as we go back. If you don't want to hike the whole way, you're welcome to turn around, come back part way, or there's 2 picnic tables up here. You can sit in the pavilion and enjoy the creek and listen and look around. So you're welcome to
There's
enjoy.
water back there.
Yes.
Has anyone seen any glacial erratics? This is important because if you look for the glacial erratics, the restroom's next to one of them. Okay? If you look for the restroom, just...
That's not a goat.
Oh, it is pretty wet right there.
Have you seen any button bushes out here?
The willows should be here. I know it's on the property. I'm not sure if it's on the willows.
All right, we're going to stop right here. I'm just going to mention something. So as you come up here, you'll be able to see Cusawago Creek, and our trail loosely follows the edge. So you'll be able to look over, and maybe we'll see some wood ducks as we go along. One of the things you'll note is there's a couple dead trees. Very good, yeah. There's a couple of dead trees around here. Does anybody know what kind of tree this is or
Ash.
was? Oh, I think he knows.
Try an ash.
Ash, yeah. So the emerald ash borer has made its way through this area, and this is what you'll see. The bark will start to become kind of this tan color because the woodpeckers come and peel it away to get bugs out of the tree. So you may see some of these through the area. They serve as some wildlife habitat, so as long as it's not going to fall on the pavilion or anything, we aren't going to go and cut them all down. So this pavilion here was on the property when we purchased it, along with some other buildings which have been raised. But as Bob mentioned, we had a Boy Scout come to us looking for a potential eagle project. So we talked to him about our different properties in the area. Again, he was from Cambridge Springs, and we came out here and looked at this, and he really loved this area. And he said, well, how would you like a picnic table? So we have a nice, beautiful ADA accessible picnic table under there. He also painted the interior and built a display case that's in the back that we'll be able to put an extra map or some more information about the property in it. So it's a great project. We also received some grant funding last year from the Crawford County Community Heritage Foundation. And they were able to provide us with funds to put some gravel around the pavilion. There was a kind of a drop off there before, and also gravel some sections of the trail too. So every little bit helps, and we rely heavily on volunteers to help us steward these properties. So we're going to continue on here down the trail. You know what this is, Ellery? I've never seen that. Go ahead and move up just a little bit. We'll put everyone on the side of the gate. So, along with managing the improvements, the trails, the parking lots, and so on, we do other things on our property, like we attempt to manage the invasive species. That's a tricky task because the new seeds are always being carried in. But does anybody recognize this and know what it is? Yes?
It's garlic mustard. Garlic mustard,
yes. So this is all around, and particularly in disturbed areas. So driving down the road, it's always in ditches and road banks. And
what is it?
Garlic mustard. So, Charles, correct me if I'm wrong, the big problem with this is the West Virginia white butterfly attempts to lay its eggs on this, and they are no longer viable after they're laid on this. It looks like the what plant?
Well, it's in the mustard family, and it's related to some of our wildflowers that the butterfly normally lays its eggs on,
mm-hmm.
and the caterpillars usually eat. But the mother gets fooled by this because it's also in the mustard family like the other ones, and she lays her eggs on that, and then the caterpillars are unable to survive on it.
Can you eat it?
You can.
You can make pesto.
Yep.
So I have not, but I shouldn't have any problem finding any to make some.
It's kind of bitter.
Yeah. Lots of butter, add that to it. Or
well, yeah.
But it has a garlicky smell too.
Yeah.
A little bit.
So Charles has something else here, which you'll see around. Does anybody know what this is? Yes. So this is another invasive that's a shrubby type invasive that grows around. The shrub this came from is right there. So it has these bright green leaflets, and it'll get little white flowers here in a month or so. And
did you say it was?
Multiflora rose. Here's some more. We got the root too. So
no, that's different.
Oh, this is different. Oh, this is honeysuckle.
Bush honey.
This is bush honeysuckle. So from a distance, they kind of look similar. They're both green, but but this is another problem that we'll encounter. So as you walk back, notice these. Some properties we've been able to get some funding through the Game Commission through their VIPA HIP program, which is a landowner cooperative for managing properties. And we've manually pooled some of these with volunteers, and we've also sprayed some of these as well to help manage the populations or eliminate them if possible. So, all right, we'll continue on.
Let's talk a little bit about the diversity of this bottomland. And in particular, Tyson was noting that this is a pool over here. And you see it's sitting in a little depression in the bottomland. It could be at one point years and years ago when Cussawago Creek came up and was flooding, it actually carved that out. And you have places in the bottomland called flood channel scars. And the creek's no longer there, but it either was there eons ago, or when it floods, it especially goes over and carves out an area like that. It adds some micro topography into the bottomland, and that topography gets selected out by different species of the plants. Some of them like to be up a little higher and drier, and others a little wetter. and then you have also these pools. And in this case, this pool is relatively small, but it would be still used as vernal pools are by amphibians in particular to come in, lay their eggs, and breed. These pools in different parts of Pennsylvania, they fluctuate during the year. Some of them dry all the way out, and others they'll retain some mud, maybe a little water. But one of the key features of them is that fish cannot live in them because they fluctuate so much, and the fish can be killed out at some point, which makes them good for things like tadpoles to survive if they hatch from frog eggs or salamander eggs. Somebody had just found a red F. Some of you got to see it, the little salamander, the terrestrial, the forest life cycle stage of the red-spotted newt, and it's called a red eft. It's a bright orange-red salamander that lives in the forest for 4 or 5 years after it climbs out of the vernal pool, having been a tadpole in there, and then when it reaches adulthood, it goes back to the water and lives in the pool as an adult and breathes there. But the vernal pools aren't so good for that species because, like the fish, as an adult it needs permanent water, and if these fluctuate too much, you don't get that. So that's a small one there. You can see some skunk cabbage right close by it, indicating the wet soils. That's about it for that one. Anybody have any questions or see anything else? We'll look for an
hemlocks evolving out of these kind of creek bottoms and that kind of thing.
How are
hemlocks
how are they evolved?
out of, because is the climate in these areas warming to the point they won't be able to be in here, or they've been cut out to the point that
The eastern hemlock is doing pretty well right now, but because the climate has been changing for a while, it's been predicted. They've modeled out, the best conditions for certain species to live in, and they've done that for trees in Pennsylvania. The eastern hemlock is one that by the beginning of the next century, it could be leaving Pennsylvania almost entirely. It depends on these models for climate change and how severe it could be, or if it's less severe, you'll have different changes. But so far, so good. We're in kind of a cooler area. Hemlock right now is more vulnerable in those kind of marginal habitats where it might occur on one side of a hill because it's a little cooler and moist, higher moisture there, and not so much on the other. But those topographies are changing now in terms of the climate. So. Cool.
Behind us again, we can see Tuscaloosa Creek bend in the stream. Those of you who live close by here, remember back in January we had really high water. We had a big flood. I think French Creek was at its second highest level ever recorded. So we came out here and got some photographs, and the water was just about 3 feet down this bank. That's how high it was, and there were huge sheets of ice that had formed, and in some places it had broken off the tree, not broken the trees off, but the ice had broken while still staying connected to the trees, and there were like donuts around each one. So it made for some pretty cool photographs, but again, the water just changes so much here with the storm events. Owner of the property used this as a private hunting and fishing preserve. So there's some of the previous management with that landowner involved that. So there were some tree stands and things around, and there was a cabin in the woods that was moved out at one point. And then this was used for waterfowl hunting and fishing and so on, which of course it's open for that for anybody to come in now and use. So this trail continues on a little ways, a few hundred yards, and then it'll dead end, and then we'll head back. So at this point, if you just want to look around, you're free to walk to the end of the trail, take a look at the pond, and then we'll walk back to the pavilion area. So that site has been restored, and much of the area between the parking lot and the pavilion was formerly lawn, and as you can see, it's reverting quite well back to forest. There's a lot of native trees that have taken root and are growing well. The following year, we planted about 15 acres of trees just south here on Route 98 on the smock tract, and some of those species included maple leaf viburnum, silver and red maple, white pine, black willow, and silky dogwood. 2 years later, in 2015, we had a group of volunteers go out to check the success of those plantings, and we found at that time that 74% of the trees had survived and 60% for the shrubs, which is impressive. And if you drive past, you'll see a lot of the tree tubes are still there protecting those trees. And as they grow up and out of those tubes, they'll be removed. In 2016, when we acquired the Wills Tract, we were able to raise some structures that were on that property as well, the carriage house and barns. And then the following year, last year, we removed about 300 tires that were discarded along the edge of the fields on that property. And we had help with several volunteers and some equipment that was allowed for us to be used from Ernst Conservation Seed to get those tires out. And the Bridgestone Tires Forward program paid to remove those tires from the site and recycle them. That year we also worked to remove an elevated hunting tower that was on the property, which is a liability for us. So we continue to make improvements and remove any smaller structures that exist on that land. I mentioned when we were on the Cats tract that there was, or a smock tract rather, that we received a grant last year to add some gravel to the trails. We also, with some of that money, were able to make improvements to the other parking area along Route 98 on the Wills Tract. You got to see some of the work of the Boy Scout as we went by the pavilion with the new table and the painting and the display case. So that's welcomed help for us. We also had an Eagle Scout work on a project at our Utica access property south of here along French Creek, which is a canoe access point. You may have noticed that as you got off the bus, you walked across some metal plates to get into the parking lot. Next week, those will be removed and a new culvert will be installed there, which will make accessing the property much easier, especially for larger vehicles such as this. In the future, WPC is considering enrolling the Wills Tract in the WRE program, which is Wetland Reserve Easement Program, which would help fund the restoration of some of the old fields back into the wetlands that they once were. At our first stop at the Cussawagga Bottom Conservation Area, again, when that was acquired in 2014, we were able to immediately remove the structures that were on that property. And then in the spring of 2017, as Bob mentioned earlier, 4 duck boxes were erected on that property by DU volunteers. We thank them for that work. Last year, as part of the French Creek cleanup, we removed several thousands of pounds of trash from that property from an old farm dump. We seem to find on a lot of our properties that were once farms that folks didn't use landfills, they had their own. So we do our best to clean those up and make the places safer and more attractive for our guests. One of the other items we've been working on this spring in particular is education on our properties with school students. We collaborated with the University of Pittsburgh's Pymatuming Lab of Ecology staff earlier this year to place digital audio recorders on some of the vernal pools
pools and the larger pond on the cat's property, and also on one of the ponds in the Cussawagga Bottom Conservation Area. This was part of the AZA, American Zoological Association's Frog Watch program. So one of the staff from the climate teaming lab facilitated that, placed the recorders, and then took the recordings into classrooms for students to analyze and identify what species were being recorded and present in those properties. We then went to schools and asked any of the participants if they'd like to come out to our properties, and we had 3 high schools that came out 2 weeks ago to do dip net surveys in some of those vernal pools and the ponds to see what aquatic life was present there. So the students really enjoyed that. We had high school students from Conneaut Area Senior High School, Greenville Senior High School, and then St. Joseph's Catholic High School near Natrona Heights. So we hope to continue that program in the coming years, either on these properties or others in the region.
Excuse me, everybody. Just going to get started here. There's still plenty of lunch here, so help yourself. Feel free to get up, get seconds, thirds. I don't know about you, I'm kind of disappointed. I thought we were having garlic mustard pesto for lunch. I heard that earlier on, but no, lunch was delicious. So please help yourself to more. I'm Brenda Costa. I'm the Executive Director of the French Creek Valley Conservancy, and I just want to tell you a little bit about our organization today. I appreciate not having to give the bus talk because I get motion sick, so if I was on the bus facing backwards talking to you, that wouldn't have been very nice. So I'll just stand up here and talk today instead. So French Creek Valley Conservancy, as Tom said earlier this morning, we're a part of a big group, but we at FCVC, and I'm going to use our acronym because that's easier for me, we are the local face of conservation. We work in the French Creek Watershed every day. This is what we do, is concentrate in this area. The Conservancy was actually formed in 1982 from a grassroots effort for a group of citizens that was concerned about issues with spreading of herbicides in the Conneaut Lake area. So the organization originally started as the Conneaut Lake French Creek Valley Conservancy, and I'm glad we have condensed that down a bit. But so since then, FCVC has gained accreditation. We are now an accredited land trust through the Land Trust Alliance, and so that keeps us to a level of standard in the work that we do in protecting land in the watershed. And why do we do what we do? Fortunately, we've had other folks today tell you about how special and unique this area is and why it is so worthy of our protection. I have spent a lot of time over the last few weeks in school presentations. I was at Penn State Barron this week at the Great Lakes Children's Festival, and so I got to talk about the unique biodiversity of French Creek almost every day over the last few weeks, and it really is an amazing treasure and worthy of our protection. Tom talked this morning a little bit about our French Creek Collaborative. We are a small organization. We are small but mighty. I had to laugh this morning. There are more people here from Western Pennsylvania Conservancy than we have total employees. You outnumber me and you didn't even bring your whole group. We are a small organization, but we get a lot of work done, and in part that's because of the very important partners that we work with. Our French Creek Collaborative is made up of Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, Nature Conservancy, Audubon, Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania Environmental Council, and recently we have added Ducks Unlimited. And this is a really important thing to point out, that we all succeed at a higher level when we work together. We would not be able to do what we do here locally on the ground every day without having these other organizations to support us. We just don't have all of the resources that we would need to do this level of work on our own. So for a little group like us, increasing our acreage by 25% is a big deal. We have a number of properties that we own outright, fee simple properties, but we also have quite a few properties that have conservation easements on them. There's a level of protection where the landowner's retaining their ownership of the property, but we've struck a deal that says we're going to conserve the natural state of this property, and you can continue to use it as you would like to as a property owner. And so the conservation easements make up about 2/3 of our property now, and we own about 1/3 of our property outright. You can see, my pointer works here, we do have properties spread throughout the watershed. We're kind of concentrated in the middle third, but we're branching out and reaching further into the farther reaches of the watershed. Now the project that I want to highlight today is our recent Conneaut Lake Park Wetlands project. If you're from this area, familiar with this area, you're probably familiar with Conneaut Lake Park. Conneaut Lake Park is an amusement park that actually opened in 1892. And by gosh, if they aren't still holding on all these years later. But interestingly, not too many years ago now, Conneaut Lake Park filed for bankruptcy in 2014. Conneaut Lake Park has been governed by a board of trustees in concert with the Economic Progress Alliance of Crawford County. And so when they were filing for bankruptcy, we were working with them on some property that they had adjacent to the park. And this is a large wetlands tract, and the discussion arose that that property really was not an asset for them to include in their bankruptcy filing. This property held no development potential whatsoever, and so it was almost more of a liability for the park than an asset to be included in their bankruptcy filing. So we worked with them through the Economic Progress Alliance to ask them to include a property donation to us in their bankruptcy filing. So this is Conneaut Lake, west of Meadville, if you're not familiar. Conneaut Lake here, these three yellow areas here are French Creek Valley Conservancy's conserved properties around the lake. This is an exciting one. We just acquired this one in October. This is actually a property that's about 85 acres, and it was intended to be a housing development. All around this area, you can see there's a significant amount of housing development there. But this property had been acquired by a developer, and then they found that the site conditions didn't match their needs for infrastructure. And they held on to it for about 25 or 30 years. And finally, originally they wanted us to buy it. And in the end, fortunately, we were able to have that donated to us. So we now have this 86 acres over here, which is open to the public for hiking, watching, bird watching, enjoying and spending time in nature. We have a conservation easement on a property over here, but the one I want to talk about today is this wetlands area here. And it's important to note, if you look around Conneaut Lake, almost the entire area around Conneaut Lake has been developed in residential properties. There's an area up here to the north that it currently is a farm, but it's a wet area that has not been developed residentially. There's a small area over here, and then otherwise there's this area here where we've worked on the acquisition we're going to talk about now. Zooming in on this a bit, this is Conneaut Lake Park up here, and as you can see, this area down here really didn't hold any development potential for the park. And when they were liquidating assets to try to raise funds in their bankruptcy filing, again, this one wasn't going to hold too much potential for them. So we had approached them about working on a donation. So these are the properties that we ended up acquiring. There's 2 adjacent parcels, and they total over 50 acres. There's another small piece down here that was included in this as well, but the Conneaut Lake Park Board of Trustees was able to donate this property to us outright. And when we were talking about me doing this presentation today, I was worried because as this date has been approaching and we still hadn't closed and still hadn't closed and still hadn't closed, I didn't want to come and fib and say that we actually owned this when we didn't, but thankfully as of this week, we do indeed own this property. But this property is very difficult to see from land. This certainly wasn't a stop we were going to be able to make on our trip today. And if we tacked it on the end, we would have really gotten wet. But fortunately, we had a friend of our organization who was able to go out and shoot some drone footage of this property. So you'll be able to watch this footage of this property. If this works. Wait. And I wish today had been this nice, because this was a beautiful day. These guys were out filming this. But this is flying into the property from the south. And this tree line up here is the northern boundary of the property. And our acquisition starts about this point and heading north. Now, obviously, we all know the importance of wetlands. Certainly in an area like this where the majority of the perimeter of Conneaut Lake has been developed in a residential setting, these are even more valuable. Wetlands are the storage area of a fresh water body. So it's very important for storage of water within a wetland. They're very important for filtering sediment, but they are also incredibly important habitat. So around the immediate perimeter of Conneaut Lake, this is the largest remaining section of wetlands in the area. Now this property will be open to the public. If you want to hike right out there, feel free to take a walk right out. But these all of our properties that we own outright, not our conservation easements, but our fee simple properties, are open to the public and open for public enjoyment. This is open for hunting, fishing, recreation. As I said, we just closed on Thursday, so there's not even a sign to tell you where we are quite yet. But this is an exciting acquisition. It'd be nice if we were out doing this today. I think that's it. So why are we presenting this project today? Because we owe great thanks to Ducks Unlimited for helping us with this project. We often have properties donated to us. We are very fortunate. A lot of our acquisitions come to us in the way of donation. However, there's always still significant costs associated with a property, even if someone has donated it to us. There's cost to steward these properties going forward. We protect these properties in perpetuity, but there's the immediate expenses of due diligence and the closing costs for this property. So as part of the wetlands initiative that Ducks Unlimited has in this area, Ducks Unlimited was, and we appreciate this greatly, was able to donate to us the funds to do the due diligence work for this property. We did a phase 1 environmental site assessment to understand the existing and historical environmental conditions on the property. There's a very complex survey done on this property. This property, we have about 40 neighbors. It's the most neighboring parcels we've ever had before. So there's a pretty complex survey associated with this, as well as title search and the closing costs. So we are very appreciative of DU and the donors who support them in order to help fund those expenses for us. So just a couple more snippets about what we do. Sean was talking earlier, it was either Sean or Tyson was talking about the educational work that they've been doing in the French Creek Watershed. We do an extensive amount of educational work within the watershed as well. We, as I said, are a small organization, but fortunately, just this past year, we've been able to bring someone on who does our education and outreach. She spends 20-25 hours a week out doing presentations in school groups and community groups to inform them about the importance of protecting French Creek. We did more than 100 in-school presentations last year throughout the watershed, reaching more than 2,000 students, school students, and we are now going into classrooms at the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade level, aligning with student curriculum and continuing to teach them about the importance of the watershed, fighting pollution, and the importance of conservation efforts. So we're very fortunate that we are able to have that on top of our land protection projects that we do. Tyson also mentioned about our French Creek cleanup. We hold our French Creek cleanup. This year will be the 26th annual French Creek cleanup. It will be held September 8th. It's always the Saturday after Labor Day. Last year, we had more than 750 volunteers come out throughout the watershed to help us clean up garbage. I always say that last year we got over 32,000 pounds of garbage out of the watershed. And I always say that's not from the main stem of French Creek. I don't want people to think that they're going to go visit French Creek and there's going to be a car chassis sitting there or something. We've actually found that we've done such a great job cleaning up the main stem of French Creek and many of its tributaries that we are now working on some of these other side projects. And in this case, we worked with WPC to do some cleanup on the properties that they had recently acquired where they located some of these dump areas. Cleaning up the watershed as a whole is really important. It's not just all about the main stem of French Creek. So we're glad that we're able to partner in that sense and have a bigger impact by including those kinds of efforts in our projects. So this is where you can find us at FrenchCreekConservancy.org. We just recently moved to a new office, so our new office address is at 411 Chestnut Street in Meadville. I have some information about our organization or business cards if any of you are interested in learning more. And if you're interested in volunteering, we are having some pop-up cleanup events at some of our properties, or you can also join us for our French Creek cleanup, which is really a great time. But you can find information at our website. Thank you.
Well, we've talked about this before on Crawford County Outdoors, but you drive over French Creek on your way to work or on the way to the store. How many times a week do you do that? And don't even think about what goes on there and all the diversity that exists there and how unique that is. Thanks to all the folks who presented today on really, really interesting topics. Hunters out there, new property available right near Cussawago Creek that's going to be available to hunters here. I think 570 something acres I heard that's going to be, so that's awesome. So go check it out. Thank you for joining us today on Crawford County Outdoors. We'll talk to you next time.